Last year I had the opportunity to interview Janet Yellen. Oh my gosh, in 1 minute. So I'm currently the Chief Equity Strategist for Bloomberg Intelligence. My role is to provide research and ideas surrounding the equity market outlook globally as well as in the US. So I produce an outlook for stocks as well as a country and regional allocation matrix as well as a sector allocation, and then integrate that with our quantitative strategist who does our factor analysis, and together we provide an outlook for global stocks. I've been doing this for 2.5 years after working at Wells Fargo Securities for 18. In the last 10 years I was at Wells Fargo Securities, I ran US equity strategy. When I started as an equity strategist, Wells Fargo didn't have an equity strategist. I pitched the idea to become an equity strategist and built the team and built the product and built the group over time. In very similar fashion, when I came to Bloomberg Intelligence, they hadn't had an equity strategist in the past. There wasn't a position, so I created it and created the team.
So what is Equity Strategist about?
Yeah. I think it's about whatever an individual equity strategist makes it about, but what I make it about is a combination of fundamental, technical, and quantitative analysis to provide strategies that are going to beat the return of the market over time. So we look at what is the outlook for stocks in general, and then how are you best positioned to beat any particular benchmark, whether it be the global stock market benchmark or the S&P 500 or even the small cap index, presuming that there's a whole universe of investors still out there that is interested in achieving greater than market returns over time. How do we do that? And that's what an equity strategist does, is looks at an entire portfolio, looks at market cycles, economic cycles, looks at sort of different drivers of growth over time and tries to identify which components of the market are going to outperform and underperform in a given period of time to help investors beat the market.
Do you remember the moment when you realized that this is what you're passionate about, and that you would like to, create a position for that and pursue that in the future?
It is, because when I was very young, I was in my early 20s actually, I was working in support of the Chief Investment Officer for Evergreen Investment Management. At that time, I was doing a lot of background research. I was also meeting a bunch of strategists who were coming in to talk to our team about their outlook for stocks and their recommended strategies for investment portfolio management and the like. So at that point in time, I knew that this was something that was very, very interesting to me. I didn't know if I 100% agreed with the strategy that all of the different analysts were taking to provide that market outlook. Nonetheless, it was interesting to me because all of the strategists approached the discipline very differently. There's not one blanket approach. It also seemed very entrepreneurial. They make their business what they wanted, which I thought was really interesting. I didn't necessarily achieve that role directly. I actually went and became an economist in between, and I think that only added ultimately to becoming a strategist. But I did identify pretty young that I was very interested in fitting the pieces of a market puzzle together, trying to solve the sort of unsolvable puzzle of where markets are headed.
Can you define your strategy style? Like you said, you didn't agree with people's style. What is your style?
I'm not a purist, right? I think that what I disagree with most is people that follow a specific discipline without identifying the fact that markets change over time. So I integrate fundamental as well as technical, as well as quantitative, as well as political analysis in an overall outlook for stocks. I don't believe you can follow one of those disciplines alone and outperform, because I think, for instance, most strategists follow a very fundamental with a quant component. And it's different today than it was, say, 15 years ago. But especially 15 years ago, was very fundamentally biased. And that sort of approach to markets, particularly when you're thinking about the outlook for stocks over a 6 to 12 month basis, completely ignores the behavioral aspect of markets. It assumes that all investors are rational, and assumes all investors are going to make the same decision based upon that sort of rational analysis. And I think if you ignore behavioral analysis and you ignore the signal that the market is telling you, you're probably going to be wrong. So I started to try to integrate both of those. And then over time we discovered that more and more quantitative factors are really interesting drivers of markets as well. So we started integrating more of that. Over the last 3 or 4 years, we've found out a lot of policy. And I think the fundamental strategists over time have often explored the policy angle, so it's not exactly new. But I think combining all of these different disciplines makes us somewhat unique. It also makes us very changeable, and it creates an environment in which I'm constantly learning more about the market, and allows me that growth.
Can you describe your typical working day?
There is no typical working day for me. At Bloomberg, we're obviously not only a gigantic data provider, software service, but we're also a media organization. So my day can be comprised of television and radio interviews, as well as client visits, as well as spending a good deal of time researching and discussing ideas for research and analysis with my team, to actually crafting research reports and publishing those research reports in collaboration with an editor. It's sort of a multifaceted day, and never is there the same day twice. I also manage a team of about a dozen people, so obviously there's heavy managerial responsibility that is involved with that, and we've been building up the team over time and hope to continue growing it in the future. So there's a lot of different components to my day depending upon the day.
How does it compare to your working day when you started your career in finance?
Incredibly different. When I started my career in finance, I actually came out of undergrad and went into a rotational management training program for asset management. So I spent a few months with all the different divisions of asset management within the company then known as First Union, ultimately became Wachovia, which ultimately became Wells Fargo. But it was a rotational program for 2 years. So I spent time in trust operations, I spent time with advisors, I spent time in, accounting. I spent all kinds of different, just basically getting exposure was the goal of the program. And so it's very different than the responsibilities that I carry today. It was also very much less focused. It was more about attaining exposure and understanding of how these moving parts work, with the intention of, in addition to developing managerial skills, with the intention of ultimately working on a managerial track in one of the departments.
How long did it take you to figure out that you want to do equity strategy?
Oh, it took me a while. So when I first joined, I was in the managerial program. That lasted 2 years. During the time there, I identified the idea that I really did want to be in investments, and I wanted to be in front office investments where I would have the opportunity ultimately to work with clients, but I was on the buy side. So we were in the actual application of portfolio management, actually running funds, actually interacting with the end client on managing their portfolios and the like. I thought that was very intriguing until I started to see sell-side analysts come through. And at that point, I do think I identified the idea that one of the things that I like most about the field is really actually the research and the articulation of your conclusions. I love interacting with clients who are the investors of the money for the ultimate investor. I think that it's not necessarily that I identified right away that I wanted to be an equity strategist. I saw some models of equity strategists and thought, that's really interesting. I think I could probably be pretty good at that eventually. But what really drives me is just as I mentioned earlier, it's solving the puzzle. And it's putting the pieces together. It's being extremely curious about what's driving markets, what's likely to continue to drive markets, and identification of those factors that drive markets and how they might impact a portfolio for me is the ultimate sort of driver. It's my ultimate passion.
Yeah, it's actually the next question. What do you love the most about your job? And if there were 3 things, would it be solving a puzzle, articulating conclusions, and interacting with clients?
Probably, yeah. Those are pretty great. Yeah, I'd say that those are the three things I like most. I mean, the other thing that just generally I like a lot about my job is that no day is the same. I don't come into an office and have the checklist of 15 things that I do every single day. It's never the same. No day is the same. There are always new challenges. Many of those new challenges are brought on by the markets themselves. Markets always surprise us, right? Nobody has perfect foresight into what the market is going to do. That's always exciting. And then structurally, I think that the nature of my role is such that I have to be both reactive and proactive. And that's, to me, very challenging and interesting.
Yeah, the next question is what the hardest aspect or the largest challenges of what you do. So unpredictable markets and dealing with that, maybe managing your team and some other...
Balancing all the different things that I have to do. Managing a team. It's also creating an outlook for the broad stock market. It's identifying what factors, sectors, styles are likely to outperform and underperform. It's articulating those conclusions in both written and verbal form through multimedia channels. It's more finding a balance of figuring out a way to accomplish all these goals. A big one is growing our business, trying to find ways not only for myself to ultimately have an impact on the investor base, but everyone on my team as well. Growing all of their franchises to make a big impact on the investment universe.
Can you think of some inspiring story that happened through your work? Like maybe some moment in your work that you felt most proudest of what you do?
Last year I had the opportunity to interview Janet Yellen, and that was a big career win for me. To be recognized as a big enough leader and voice in the financial industry to be asked to interview Janet Yellen at a conference that included upwards of 2,000 people on a stage was a huge moment for me. I find tremendous achievement and pride in every presentation I do. It's something I really enjoy. It's something I feel I can have a big impact on broad audiences in articulating our investment conclusions and talking about some of the alternative ways that we approach analysis of markets. We find new ways to think about markets on a daily basis. We find new relationships and identify that for an investment universe. And I love to communicate that to audiences. So every presentation I give gives me that same degree of satisfaction.
Do you have any indicators when you communicate your ideas to the audience? How do they react that you feel you reached them and they understood your message?
Yeah. Mostly it's because I get a tremendous amount of questions and follow-up after the presentation. So when I feel least successful is if I have a presentation and nobody asks me a question and nobody sends me an email to follow up with more questions. When I feel most successful about being able to impact an audience is when I have a back and forth discussion about some of the topics that we introduced, when we have people contact us to try to replicate or dig deeper into some of our models. Those are, pretty clear indications to me that I'm reaching an audience that's quite interested in what we do.